Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a special series of the Changing Hearts and Minds podcast. So I'm back with Yangbo. Hi, Yangbo. How are you?
Very well.
Yangbo, I'm really excited about this topic. We're going to talk about how we create new commerce incubators. And it's really all around fueling innovation with them using these incubators, as well as upskilling an existing workforce. And I'm gonna start with the fact that incubators are not anything new, but they do have a very specific traditional model. And I'd love your take on traditional versus modern incubators that really focus on fueling innovation and workforce upskilling.
Indeed. Now, when it's beginning to change, but when many think of incubators these days, many of them consider them as, well, you just offer some low-cost real estate and hope things populate. It's not always the case. They would even hire entrepreneurs themselves to run them, and for a good reason, many of them end up underperforming. Now, where we are trying to shift this incubator model towards is one that is a lot more of an incentive driven approach that you take what strengths are in the communities, so what industries are particularly strong, as well as what are target industries, and then use those as anchors to catalyze an ecosystem around improving these sectors, around creating new products and services that build on these strengths. And ideally, you'd actually want to hire entrepreneurs themselves to run them, since they're the ones who have the most ground net level knowledge and expertise on how do you get a company, how do you get an undertaking from just a concept to something that is reality and generating value.
Yeah, exactly. I think part of this is making sure that incubators have a much more connected process. And especially when it comes to innovation, sometimes we think, okay, well, we need people skilled in a very particular skill set without realizing that eh, those people that are going to get this new skill set to manage the technology are now creating a gap for the skills that they left. So now we have to kind of take this staircase approach of everybody moving up one or two steps, and some may move in various as in multiple steps, but the whole purpose is that all of those are interconnected with each other and there's no gap in the process. Because that's often how a lot of these incubators actually end up dying out. If it's not investment, then it's often skill set and the ability to drive things forward across them. Now, part of this incubator model, this new commerce incubator model, also takes into consideration that we're focusing on the built environment. We're focusing on using existing systems so we don't have to reinvent the wheel and we don't have to start another initiative. We can actually build on the existing strengths that lie into it. And that's also part of the strategy lab process where INNOVO does a really good job of identifying what technologies would leverage those strengths a bit more. Can you talk a little bit more about what that process is like as far as identifying the strengths for kind of percolating a new commerce incubator brief that would come together?
Hmm. Where one would start is, what is your situation now? Where do you want to be? Say, however many decades, say a decade, 2 decades, maybe three, depends. And then if you have an idea of where are these key industries going? How are they evolving? What potential changes would they undergo in the coming years? Then you can have a clear idea of what you need to do. So as far as INNOVO is concerned, like we're focusing on profitable net zero undertakings. So how do then, so we understand with under the Paris Agreement, to have emissions by 2030, get to net zero by 2050. So with that pathway, what would be opportunities that you can pursue that would enable that cluster of industries in your community, and based on strengths, what would best enable them to work their way on that path and unlock additional value generating opportunities on the way.
Yeah, and I have a high appreciation for that approach because we have a similar one at BMG. While that's occurring, we kind of work through what is the emotional demand that we need to create so that way those types of technologies, we identify the types of skill that is needed so we can build on those. And that could be as simple as, revitalizing a downtown, right? That's what we want to do. We want to create a new commerce incubator focused on the existing downtown area. And part of that would be, well, what would we put in these? What are the complementary services and what are those skill sets that need to go in? And it needs to also be focused on skills that are competitive and they are driving a higher rate of a higher quality of living than what they were before. So we don't necessarily want to go to the lowest common denominator of the type of skills, but we do want to have a diverse enough skill set or talent pool that it still has a sense of resiliency in it while making sure we're leaning on the strengths. And while we're talking about that, the other component is understanding where the current economic demands lie. If there are, some early strengths that we can build upon, it often is a great driver for new populations to come in and also be kind of a gap filler in many of those instances, which then produces more business ideas and planning structures to come into pass. So that's really how we focus on the output. Let's talk a little bit more about the impacts and outcomes of incubators for new commerce. I know on the BMG side, there's a lot of business immigration processes. There's a lot of new business formations that tend to occur. What about areas in the circular economy as far as impact and outcome that can be seen?
That's very complementary, in fact, to what you described, and it's a term that was first popularized by the University of Wisconsin about 3 decades ago, called high road development. So instead of trying to, as you mentioned, track the lowest common denominator, you're focusing on what can add the most value across all fronts. It's not just purely on a narrow financial basis, but also much more broadly on an economic basis. So if we take circular economy as an example, then it's thinking, well, everything that is now going to waste. So refuse streams, it could be CO2 emissions, it could be solid waste that still nonetheless contains a number of valuable materials for industry, that if that can then be redirected so that it does indeed provide a source of materials for domestic industry, then that's going to be beneficial. Not only have you dramatically reduced the environmental downsides of a production, but just by taking what has gone to waste and repurposing into value, you've actually ended up turning that cost center into a profit center.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way of viewing it because I think this entire model really follows the circular economy framework in the sense of bringing in that early structure, making sure that we have all these pieces tightened up. So as a particular net zero technology comes into play, we're identifying the skills that we need to fulfill it, and then we're identifying the new business formations to supplement that influx in cash flow that is going to occur in that region from that, and also what types of new business concepts that need to be drawn out, which drives an entrepreneurship initiative right off of it, and then their skill sets needed, and this becomes a very nutritious cycle across the board, which then further increases population migration into the area and then drives even further growth. And I think part of this, the process is an incubator should not necessarily be isolated. The purpose is to kind of have a foundation, a couple of seeds planted, so that way it can enrich a whole ecosystem on a long-term basis. And I know one of our pilot programs that we're thinking about doing in the very near future is really creating these two, where how can we revitalize small towns while upskilling a workforce so there's much more resiliency from an economic risk perspective, or reducing economic risk from that aspect in a number of cities in the US specifically. Um, any last takeaways that
Yeah.
we should share with the audience? We'll link our Calendly at the end for those that have specific questions, but just some key takeaways that we should share amongst our listeners.
Yes, and keep all this in mind that none of these interventions, none of these principles or pillars, however you call them, are really novel anyway, that they have actually had a proven track record in places. And it's a really good point that you brought up the question of migration, since there has actually been ample empirical evidence. If you look at communities in upstate New York and a number of other places where an influx of immigrants, or in much of the case, upstate New York, refugees in that case, actually managed to revitalize what used to be underutilized downtowns and actually turn them into vibrant activity hubs, thanks to their entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of the interesting things about these is it doesn't necessarily have to be locally focused, but in this case it is very positively locally impacted. So the elements that we're really working through is how do we make sure that the population that is there is the one that thrives across the board, and the those that are investing or participating in different forms are getting the benefits. So we want this to be a well-rounded and a symbiotic relationship between all of the parties involved, including the businesses that may want to migrate to this area because there's a talent pool available for them to tap into that may not have been. Um, and I think as we talk about using what's existing and maximizing value within those strengths, leads us in it leads us really well into the next topic that you and I are going to talk about, which is around preservation focused tourism for those type. So we will have that conversation and release that soon. But thank you so much for your time, Yangbo. That was great.
You are very welcome.